Black Sabbath, Paranoid. This one is completely expected, as Black Sabbath is often credited with inventing metal music in general, as well as doom metal, the first metal genre. It's interesting listening to early metal, as the blues influence is a lot more apparent, especially here on tracks such as Electric Funeral and the famous War Pigs.
Generals gathered in their masses.
Everything about this record is classic, despite the fact that this album is well before my time. My favorite track, Iron Man, is actually the first metal song I consciously remember hearing. That droning guitar intro always stuck out to me. Most of the album consists of slower bluesy riffs, but some tracks, like Paranoid, show the faster style, which would catch on later in the decade. The influence of this record cannot be overstated. This really is the prototypical metal release. Haunting vocals, wailing drums, thumping bass, and thundering guitar. Not to mention the anti-war themes of War Pigs.
As the war machine keeps turning.
And the doomer loner vibe of Paranoid. As these are iconic metal lyric staples.
Storm coming, you better hide from the atomic tide.
Sir Lord Baltimore, Kingdom Come.
I hear sirens calling me.
This is a less well-known release. I suppose it's debatable if it's truly metal, but for 1970, this was remarkably heavy. I wouldn't go so far as to call it doom metal like Sabbath, but this is absolutely proto-metal. It definitely takes things further than the average rock and roll of the time. The title track is dangerously close to that doomy quality of Sabbath, but most of it has that Led Zeppelin vibe, even down to having a medieval-esque softer track much like Zeppelin. These two songs are highlights, along with Lady of Fire. Judas Priest, Sad Wings of Destiny.
You're in for a shock.
First off, what an album cover. Doesn't get much more epic than that. Of course, many know Judas Priest as the iconic heavy metal band. And when I say heavy metal, I mean the new wave of British heavy metal sound specifically, not just metal music in general. That particular sound is certainly present on this record, especially on The Ripper. However, this record is actually quite a bit more varied than their later releases. It flirts with doom metal at times, like on Victim of Changes, and proto-metal on tracks like Tyrant. This is probably the most unique record that Judas Priest ever put out, and for 1976, this was an absolute game changer. There's a lot of classic Halford screams, but also bluesy vocals that are perhaps best left in the 70s, but interesting to hear, nevertheless. Motorhead, Bomber.
Don't touch that dial.
Motorhead may seem tame by today's standards, but in 1979, they were the heaviest band around. They invented speed metal, which became the precursor to both thrash metal and black metal. The rebellious spirit of metal music is found here, with tracks like Lawman, and even more so with Talking Head, where Lemmy implores us not to listen to the man who brainwashes us through the news.
Don't listen to the news. Television voice don't give you any choice. You only hear the man.
Lemmy's rough vocals also laid the foundation for more extreme forms of metal to come. And as the name implies, speed metal was a steep departure from the slower doom metal of Black Sabbath, opting instead for a faster punk-influenced sound, which is the direction that metal went in after this. Another classic and hugely influential band and record. Metallica even covered Stone Dead Forever.
Whatever happened to your life? Stone Dead Forever.
Queen, Sheer Heart Attack. Now I suppose it's up for debate if Queen is metal. Even a few years ago, I certainly would have argued that while they are a great band, they certainly aren't metal. However, after an honest listen beyond their radio hits, I think one must concede that they are at least partially metal. I would say on this record they mix proto-metal with glam rock. Certainly not the most metal thing, but remember, metal was brand new at the time, and this album was hugely influential. The song Stone Cold Crazy is considered by many to be the precursor to thrash metal, and the fact that Metallica even covered it lends some credibility to that claim. This may be a record that is too theatrical or poppy for some people's taste, but there's definitely hints of metal in there. And considering that glam metal became quite popular in the 80s, Queen were ahead of their time, and honestly, I'll take Sheer Heart Attack over the vast majority of glam metal albums. Sorcery, Sinister Soldiers. Wow, that's a bit of a tongue twister. This one is interesting. I wanted to throw a couple surprises on this list, so that it wasn't just bands that you and your dad already know. This was a little hard to do, considering that metal in the 70s is quite limited, but thankfully I found this gem. This album is so varied that almost every other song goes from doom metal one moment to punk rock the next. Then to some proto-metal with some prog rock sprinkled in. I feel that if this album had just come out about 10 years later, they probably would have blended these elements more cohesively and seamlessly. They probably would have been some sort of thrash metal band. They have little hints of proto-thrash in there, and the cover even sort of looks like if a thrash metal album came out in the 70s. But I'm glad we live in the timeline where we got this version instead. It is such a bizarre hodgepodge of sounds, but it somehow works. It is sort of speed metal too in places. It's really difficult to pin down this band's style, and that's what makes it great. To top off the weirdness, this album has a 12-minute long ballad called Last Goodbye. It is really drawn out and awkward, but I love it for some reason. It's as if it actually captures the feeling of having to say goodbye, and how uncomfortable that can be.
You're not too far away, and I know you're wondering why.
Rainbow, Rising. Released in 1976, this very well could be the first power metal album. I know some people may take issue with this declaration. No doubt this album contains a very 70s sounding proto-metal sound as well, but this also has power metal written all over it. First off, Ronnie James Dio. Enough said. Second, the album's cover is a giant hand grabbing a rainbow. Come on, even without listening to this record, this is power metal. Just listen to Run with the Wolf. This is a short record, but it's pretty fantastic. It is amazing that many of the metal greats that we associate with the 80s were already making music in the 70s. Rush, Hemispheres. Again, much like Queen, it might be a bit of a stretch to call this metal. However, this was hugely influential to the prog metal bands of the upcoming decades. I've never been the hugest Rush fan, but The Trees is a phenomenal track with a based and red-pilled message. And the concept album about the Apollonian and Dionysian brain hemispheres is pretty neat. I would say that this album is proto-metal meets prog rock and an enjoyable listen. Dust, Heart Attack.
Tell your friends not to call. Say it was suicide, yeah.
This is a solid proto-metal record. Have I said proto-metal enough times in this video already? Well, metal was in its infancy in the 70s, so there aren't nearly as many crazy offshoots and micro subgenres like there are today. The differences between the bands back then were a lot more subtle than the entropic landscape of 2020's metal. But if you want to hear a perfect example of proto-metal, this album is it. The track Suicide is the highlight for me, perfectly capturing the expression of shock present in much of 70s music.
Electrocution, I thought would make me a star. I stood in the rain with my electric guitar.
The cover is also awesome. I'm not entirely sure what Vikings have to do with the music at all, but it looks cool. This is one of the softer albums on the list.
Waiting for something that is never coming, so I guess I'll be on my way.
But the heavier moments are for sure metal. A wonderful audio experience. Legend from the Fjords.
Can you see my eyes?
Surprise, surprise, we are ending on a proto-metal release. I know this list is oversaturated by the genre, but this was just metal in the 70s. Plus, this has been an interesting retrospective, as proto-metal basically went extinct the moment the 80s began. It really is a product of its time, which is fitting, considering all these album covers feature ancient landscapes, Frazetta-style fantasy art, and has an otherworldly quality, featuring things like Vikings and ghost ships. As if this metal was a gift from the gods themselves, and this has given it a pre-modern aesthetic. This genre is also charming in its simplicity. Though in saying that, this record is nearly prog metal.
The unknown and I are both the same. Eternity is mine.
This is another record, much like Sorcery, that is hard to pin down. It has elements of doom metal, speed metal, prog rock, and even occult rock.
She held my life within her heart. I will fight them till they pay.
But if I had to call it just one thing, I would go with proto-metal. Or if I wanted to be really controversial, I'd call it prog metal. So, that's my list. I hope I did the beginnings of metal justice, while also introducing you to some obscure relics of a bygone era. The 70s was the initial impact of the introduction of the devil's music, the shock. It was a period where metal was fresh and new, and there was a lot of experimentation, as bands weren't sure what to do with this new style, or what its identity was. It was exciting, and it was scary. Everything from the covers, to the costumes, to the outrageous vocal styles, to the loud instrumentation, it was all intended to shock. And it succeeded. Next time, we will dive into the 80s, into the denial phase, where we stopped fearing the devil and started shouting at him. Until next time, our acculturation continues. What's in a meme? That is the question. Let's find out. Here are some honorable mentions.